Hello, Gary Holland here from the Data Experts Group. In this short session, I'll be walking you through some of the capabilities within our new platform, the Data Experts Integration Hub, also known as DEXI. Specifically, I'm going to walk you through in this session how to get started and how to start creating a staging environment for your organization. In a recent blog, I talked a little bit about the importance of staging and what staging is. So if you're not familiar with the concept of bringing data into a staging environment, have a quick browse through that blog and it'll give you a sense of what we're trying to accomplish and how important this is if you are really interested in having a strong information management strategy in your organization. So to get us started, I'll log in to the Integration Hub. I created a user and password earlier, so I'll log in with those details to get started. Now, within the Integration Hub, we have a concept of hubs. Okay, hubs are working areas. Hubs could be shared by groups and could be small areas to capture forecasts and small bits of tactical data. The hubs could be very large enterprise-centric areas to capture terabytes worth of application data and logs and things like that. They can really be as small as big as you want them to be. When we registered, the Integration Hub created a couple of starting hubs for us, which is what I'll be using for this demonstration. To get started, I'll just log into the first one there, which is called Sandpit 0. You'll notice because we haven't configured this, it's telling us a few things that we need to do before we can get started using the hub. The first thing I'm going to do to get us going is to take this action here, which is to download and configure a remote agent. A remote agent is a program that runs locally on your network or in the cloud or wherever you need it to be, in a place that has access to the data resources you're going to be using to do your staging. To configure a remote agent is fairly straightforward. We'll click on the configure button. There's a few options to configure. We need to give it a name, which is just a recognizable name that'll appear up here when we're connected. We can embed the username in the download, which means that when we run it, it'll automatically authenticate for us. Do note that it doesn't download a password, so your password's not going to be sitting there unsecured. It uses an encrypted token. We can instruct it whether we want it to auto upgrade, the sorts of logs that we would like to have, and the privacy level. What the privacy level lets us do is basically says how locked down the data you want the data on your network to be. If you want the data to completely locked, and what that means is that the data that is used by the remote agent to run integration jobs and to load staging data and other things Hub portal, such as being able to do quick previews and things like that, but it does keep your data locked down. You can actually just allow data uploads only, so that would just let functions such as uploading flat files through the browser be allowed, or you can allow uploads and downloads, which basically means we're still keeping your data secure, but what that means is the data does go up through the central web server when people are doing previews and things like that. We can also say whether we want to allow users to use Azure storage for this as well, and the platform that we'll be running it on. Right now we support Windows either with .NET Framework version 4.6 or a standalone version, or on Mac OS X or Linux Ubuntu. I'm running on Windows, so I'll download the agent for that one. So if we click there and download it, this will just take a second. It's a very small download. You can see this one's 8.1 megabytes. And I'll just open and unzip that to a directory. I'll display the folders after we unzip it. Now all we have to do to get started, and the instructions are down here, I just need to run a little unblock script so we can run the program. and then we just double click on the Dexy remote exe. Okay, and if everything's worked, it should come up with a message saying that the user authentication has been successful. Okay, so we now have a remote agent running on the local network, and that'll show the logs and any things that you need will be shown there. If we go back to the browser, there's one last thing we need to do to be able to start using that, which is to authorize it back within the browser. So if I click on the authorize button down here, you'll see it's appeared over here. So there's one there from an earlier session I did, is still appearing, but we'll authorize this one. Now, if it authorizes successfully, what we should see is a server connected appear up here. Okay, and that all looks like it's running successfully now. Okay, so that's configuring a remote agent. We can just let that run at this point now. If I go back to the sandpit, there's a few other things that we need to do as well. The next one is we need to create a managed data point. Okay, data points are connections or pointers to our data. And the managed data point is a very important one because that is effectively your hub. Okay, the integration hub needs to have access to one database that it has full control over. So it'll create our staging tables within there, it'll create audit data, validation, rejection, and all other sorts of information that it uses to run the hub. Okay, creating a managed data point is fairly straightforward. I clicked on the manage button, we give it a name, we choose the type of database we want to use. Currently we support Azure Storage, SQL Server, and SQLite. If you're watching this presentation and you don't have access to one of those two, the SQLite database is basically will get created as a file on your system. You don't need any other database access to use that. Keep in mind, SQLite is more intended for testing and prototyping rather than sort of enterprise scale applications, because it is a single file. It's more intended for single user rather than multi-user. For this one, I'll configure a SQL Server database. So we can choose to enter a connection string, or we can just enter the name of the server. In the case of this one, it's just a local server that I've set up. We can use Windows authorization. That'll use the credentials that the remote agent is running under, and we can create a new database. Okay, and we'll give the database a name. I'll call it Managed Demo. Okay, you can point to an existing one, or you can create a new one. Okay. Now the last option is multi-use database. What this lets you do, if you have a managed database that you want to create multiple connections for, you can tick this button. What it does is it basically appends a code to the start of table names, just to ensure that table names are unique if you're using multiple data points to point against the one managed area. In the case of this one, I won't do that. And we can save that. You might want to do a quick test. That'll just make sure everything's going, and then we can save it. Okay, so we have a managed database. Okay, now the next thing we need to do, and we'll probably want to do this a few times, is to point to our source data. And this is where we start. This is where we're going to start creating our staging environment. So I'll create a new. I'm going to run through three scenarios, which is a source database, source flat files, and a web service. For the first presentation, I'll use a source database. For this one, I'm going to use a built-in database that comes with SQL Server, which is called AdventureWorks. I'll give it the name of AdventureWorks. Again, it'll be a SQL Server connection, and I'll point us to the local database where I have this set up. Okay. If I hit the refresh button there, it'll go and interrogate the database and tell us all the databases that are available. I didn't tick Windows Authentication, so we'll just try that one more time. Okay, and I'll select the AdventureWorks database and save that. Okay, to start staging tables within this database, the first thing we need to do is import the table metadata. Now that we've created a connection, if we click on here, we can actually say import table. There, and we can select the ones that we want to import. So for this presentation, I'll just download a couple. We could select all of these very quickly if we wanted to. Okay, so if you see now, it's actually imported the metadata for those tables. It's brought in the descriptions. If I want to have a look at that, I can go and edit the table. Okay, we can see the description there, the table name, which is actually the physical name, the logical name, which is a short name that you can change this if you want to, that reflects from what the table actually is. With some systems, the table names are very convoluted, so you'll want to give them some slightly more logical, meaningful name. And here is the column metadata that's been imported. You can see we have the column names, we have the column data types, things like integers and strings with a particular length. We have whether the column can store nulls, the logical name. You can change the logical name if you want to. As I said, some systems will have convoluted or coded names. You can put something that's more logical and understandable there. And the description. If the source table had descriptions embedded, they were imported as well. We have a few other columns here that are specific to the integration hub. This one here, the delta type, tells us what to do when we're loading changes in data. For example, the address ID in the source table was a primary key. So in terms of the delta type, it's reflected as what we call a natural key. What that means is when the staging data is loaded, it'll assume that that's the key for the data. And if it's tracking for changes, it'll check that key for changes in the data. There's different types of delta types, which I won't go into all of them, but the other one, it's used a delta type of tracking field, which means when we're testing for changes, it'll check that field as to whether it's changed. So in this particular situation, we're going to, when we load the staging table, we'll be looking for, assuming the address ID is the primary key, and we'll be checking if any of these fields have changed. Now we might have fields, for example, this row GUID field, we might say actually this changes all the time, it doesn't mean the data's changed, so we may just ignore that one. So I can actually change that from a tracking field to a non-tracking field. Okay. The next we have our validation rule, which lets us specify how we want to validate the data. Now generally during a staging we don't recommend you validate the data, because even if we have poor quality data, we still want to make sure we get it loaded into our staging environment. When I talk about validation and cleansing, I'll touch on this a little bit more. Another field we have here, which is a useful field, is called the is incremental. What that tells us is if there's a field that is continuously increasing, that might be a key field that keeps going upwards as the data changes. So if we know that the modified date always increases as data changes, we can tick that there. Now what that means is when we're running delta loads on the staging, every time it runs, it'll check for a modified date that is greater than the last run. When you have very large volumes of data in your source, that'll speed up your loads dramatically. Now if I just move across to the second last column here, security flag, this lets us determine whether we need to do anything to secure the particular column in question. Okay, to show you this one, I might actually just save this and open the other table, which was the credit card table. So For example, this particular table stores credit card numbers. Okay, now we may want to stage the credit card numbers, but if we're going to be within our compliance, PCI DSS compliance is a good example, we may be required to encrypt that data as soon as it's loaded. Now with the Integration Hub, we've made that very simple. You just indicate what sort of encryption needs to happen on this particular field, and it'll automatically encrypt it for you. Now, the types of encryption we have one called fast encrypt, which doesn't impact performance too much, and it encrypts and it salts the field. We have a strong encrypt, which performs a very strong encryption. It does a lot of iterations. It does impact the performance of the loads substantially. It'll bring a particular load's performance from usually we get around 50 to 100,000 rows per second, down to something of the order of 100 to 500 rows a second if you have strong encryption on. The important thing to remember, by the way, with encryption, if you have vendors or people bragging about how fast their encryption is, the reason we have an encryption that does slow that down the performance is because it actually needs to be slow to be strong. The way that encryption is typically broken is through what we call brute force, which is basically trying all the combinations of the key to see if we can get the right match. If the algorithm is simple, i.e. if you can load 50,000 rows a second with encryption, it means that someone who is trying to compromise that can compromise that at the same speed, and they can iterate very quickly. If you slow it down, it means the algorithm is slower, it takes more CPU cycles, and becomes virtually unbreakable. So it's up to you to choose whether the balance between whether you want it to be fast or whether you want it to be strong. The last type of encryption is a one-way hash, which basically is typically what's done to passwords and things like that. You can't decrypt a one-way hash. What you can use it for is if you hash it, you can hash the input data again and detect whether it was changed. So if you had a table that had user passwords, you might not want to store the passwords. You'll hash them, but you might want to see if a user has changed his password, which a one-way hash would detect that for you. In the case of this one, I'll show you what that actually looks like. If we go to the table data there, you'll see the credit card numbers. If I choose a encryption and put save, for all intents and purposes, they will be hidden and they will be encrypted at the source. So with this particular, the way I've set this up, our staging environment will never contain an unencrypted version of that credit card number. Okay. Staging load is fairly straightforward now. We select the tables that we want to stage. We say create new data links. In the case of this one, we're going to create staging data links. We choose the managed connection. We'll have the one we created before to create these in, and then we create them. That will go away and it'll create the jobs. We call them data links, which are the links between the source and the target, and it'll create the target tables for us. Okay. At this point, we have two data links that will load those staging tables for us. We can do a quick run just to make sure these are working. So I'll select run from the menu there. Okay, and you can see both the status for those ones have finished. Now, if we examine the target tables, we'll have a quick look at what's actually been loaded. So let's look at the person address target table. Okay, this is a similar view to what we had before. This is actually a view of a staging table. So we can see we've got our properties. We could specify a companion table, which is a reject table, or we could specify a table which we could profile results into. We'll talk about those in another session. In the columns, you'll see we have our source columns, that came from the table, things like the address ID, line 1, 2, and so forth. In addition, it's added a number of audit columns for us. So it's added a column that represents the surrogate key. Okay, the reason we have a surrogate key is this is the actual key on the table. If we have changes in the source data, the surrogate key will always increase, but the natural key may be the same. So we may keep a consistent address ID, but it may have changing address lines. The surrogate key will increment, and it'll tell us how our data has changed over time. We have columns that tell us that when this record was valid from and valid to, and if it's valid. These are standard delta types of columns. A create and update date, which just tells us when the record was physically created or if it was updated. And an audit key, which is actually a reference to the job that ran it for when it was created and updated. Okay, we'll go through these in later sessions, but all these fields are very important for tracing and auditing our data, so we can always go back and pinpoint which record and where this came from and when and how it was loaded. Okay, if we look at the data, you should see the data has been loaded successfully there. You can see the surrogate key. If I extend this down, we can see the other fields that have been loaded for each of those records. Okay. Now, there's a few other things we could do, and I might just, right now we're editing 2 data links. I'll just put us in the mode to edit 1. You'll see here, now that we're editing 1, it's shown us the full list of transforms that are available to us for this staging load. We'll go through these more in a future session. The intention of this session was just to show you how to create staging tables, but I will point you to some important other properties. So you can see here the thing you want to look at is the update strategy. This tells us how we should update our target table. And there's another options we have. We could simply truncate and reload the table every time. We could continuously append to it, so any data that comes in we append to the target table. We could append new rows and update existing rows, and this is using those natural keys that I referred you to in the table to determine how to do those updates. We could append new rows, update existing rows, and delete deleted rows. The reason we have this as a separate option is because it's a lot more work and it does impact performance to check for deleted. So if you don't need to check for deleted ones, then you might not want to take the performance hit. The last 2 ones here are similar to these 2, except they preserve changes. So what this means is if it detects an updated row, it won't just overwrite the row. It'll actually mark the row in the staging table as invalid, and it'll fill out those audit columns appropriately, and then it'll create a new row for us. So this is really useful, because what this means is a source table changes over time. We will start to capture a list of all those changes, and it can be a valuable piece of analytical data in its own right. We can specify a connection for where the audit data. I'll show you this in a moment. This is where the audit statistics, things like the rows loaded and the performance statistics, are stored. If we don't choose anything else, it defaults to the same managed connection that we specified. We can specify an error strategy. So if we have errors, do we want to reject the rows that we have, i.e. put them in a reject table, or try and load them anyhow. We can specify rows per commit. This is a performance option. Rows for progress, which tells us how often it reports back progress for long jobs to the browser. And we can specify a maximum number of rows if we want to do that. Okay. So that's all I'm going to show you for database tables. We'll get into the transformation options in a future session. Suffice to say, if you wanted to add some simple filters or mappings to the staging load, you could do that as well. We generally, as you'll see from the blog that I referred to you to, generally you don't want to do too much to staging data, because it's important that it reflects the source. So now we've built a couple of data links, and we could go ahead and do the rest of the database at this stage if we wanted to. The way to set these up to run regularly is to add them to a job. Okay, creating a job is fairly straightforward. If we go back to the data links, we select the items that we'd like to add to the job, and we say add selected to a new job. We give a job a name, so we'll say the Adventure Works Staging. Okay, what that does is automatically creates a job. Okay, and a job is a container that contains a number of data links, and it can be scheduled via what we call triggers. So you see that's created the job here, it's given it the name. We can specify a connection where the audit data gets stored. We can specify an action if one of the data links fails, whether we continue, append, and so forth. You'll see the data links have been added in here. We could edit these data links and put in dependent data links. What that would allow us to do is if we had to execute one data link for some reason before another, we could specify that in there. That said, generally the idea with staging is to load things in parallel. So hopefully with most of your staging jobs you won't need to add dependent data links. The last thing is if we click on the triggers is to put a simple schedule in place. So for example, if we wanted to run this job from today every 1 hour for every day of the week, that would be a simple way to do that. We could even specify the start and end times during the day which that's allowed to run. So that's now set to run every day. We just need to activate it. That is now set. You can see the next run is set at a specific time there. That is now set to run every hour. So in this sort of session, what we've created is a scheduled job that every hour will stage those tables into the staging database. So I think we'll end this session here. The next session we'll look at using web services and flat files potentially for staging, and we'll thank you for listening to the session. My name's Gary Holland. If you're interested in having a preview or finding out more information about our platform, please log into our website at dataexpertsgroup.com. Currently we have preview applications are open, so you just need to log in, fill out the form, and we'll look at getting you preview access to the platform I just showed you. Please feel free to comment and send any feedback to inquiries@dataexpertgroup.com. And thank you for your time.